The year was 1881, and the Texas plains were a study in loneliness. For Ezra Weston, the landscape was a mirror. It stretched out in every direction, vast and empty, under a sky that seemed to hold its breath, reflecting the hollow space inside his own chest. His ranch was an island in a sea of grama, grass and mesquite, a place where the wind was the most constant companion, and its voice was a mournful howl that scraped at the edges of his sanity. He was a man carved from the same hard earth he worked, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands calloused from labor and a face weathered by sun and sorrow. Grief had settled into the lines around his eyes, a permanent etching left behind by his wife, Martha, who had been stolen by a fever 2 winters past. She had been the heart of their home, the quiet center around which their chaotic world revolved. Now, that center was gone, and Ezra was left adrift with the 5 pieces of her she had left behind. His daughters, Abigail, the eldest at 16, wore her responsibility like a heavy cloak, her face a thundercloud of premature worry. Hannah, 14, was the quiet observer, her eyes missing nothing. 11-year-old Cora was a bundle of nervous energy, always flitting from one task to another. Esther, at 8, still asked when Mama was coming home from her long sleep beneath the cottonwood tree. And then there was Rose, only 5, a sunbeam of a child who remembered her mother only in whispered stories. They filled the small ranch house with a cacophony of life, with arguments and laughter, with tangled hair and torn dresses, with the constant pressing weight of their needs. Yet, in the midst of it all, Ezra felt a loneliness so profound it was like a physical ache. His days were a relentless cycle of duty. Before the sun bled color into the eastern sky, he was up, lighting the stove, his movements clumsy in the kitchen that had once been Martha's domain. He cooked lumpy oatmeal, braided hair with fingers too big for the delicate strands, and mended fences that seemed to break out of sheer spite. He rode the lonely fence lines, his gaze scanning the horizon not for stray cattle, but for some answer that never came. He was a father and a rancher, but he had also become a seamstress, a cook, a nurse, and a storyteller, and he was failing at all of it. The silence of adult companionship was a deafening roar that the chatter of 5 young girls could never quite drown out. It was after a dust storm, one of those malevolent brown walls that scoured the land and blotted out the sun, that his life's brittle routine was shattered. The air was thick with grit, the world painted in shades of ochre and sepia. He was riding the southern perimeter, checking for downed fences, the wind still whipping his collar against his cheek. That's when he saw a splash of color against the monotonous brown. Not a wildflower, but a heap of beaded buckskin. He dismounted, his heart thudding a cautious rhythm against his ribs. As he drew closer, the heap resolved into the form of a person, a woman. She was lying face down, her dark hair fanned out around her, tangled with burrs and dust. He knelt, his movements slow, his hand hovering over her back. He could see the faint, shallow rise and fall of her breathing. She was alive. Gently he turned her over. She was young, her face etched with fine cheekbones and a strong jaw, now slack in unconsciousness. Her skin, the color of rich earth, was dry, and her lips were cracked. A dark bruise was blooming on her temple, and one of her ankles was twisted at an unnatural angle. She was Comanche. Her dress, the intricate beadwork, the style of her moccasins, all spoke of it. She was a world away from the settlers in the town of Redemption, a world that was often at odds with his own. A cold knot of indecision tightened in Ezra's gut. The fort was a 2-day ride, and they would see her not as a person in need, but as a problem, a savage. The town of Redemption was closer, but the prejudice there ran deep and ugly. Leaving her here was a death sentence. The storm had passed, but the sun was merciless, and the coyotes would be bold by nightfall. He looked at her still face, at the vulnerability of her unconsciousness. He thought of Martha, of her unwavering belief in doing the right thing, no matter how hard. He thought of his daughters, of the world he was trying to build for them. What kind of man would he be if he rode away? Cursing his conscience, his loneliness, and the unyielding land itself, he made his choice. With a grunt of effort, he gathered the woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, but her presence was a profound weight, a responsibility that settled over him, heavier than any sorrow he had yet carried. He lifted her onto his horse, mounted behind her, and turned for home, the future a terrifying, unknown country stretching before him. The arrival of the woman who remained unconscious for the rest of the day and through the night sent ripples of chaos through the Western household. Abigail's face hardened with suspicion, her arms crossed tight over her chest. "What were you thinking, Pa? Bringing her here?" she demanded in a harsh whisper as Ezra laid the woman on a spare cot in the corner of the main room. "She would have died, Abby," Ezra said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Go fetch some water and clean cloths." Hannah watched from the doorway, silent and wide-eyed, while Cora hovered nervously behind her. It was little Rose who crept forward, her thumb in her mouth, her gaze fixed on the stranger's still face. "Is she a princess, Pa?" "No, Rosie, she's just lost." Ezra felt a pang in his chest. They were all lost, in one way or another. The woman finally woke the next morning. Her eyes, dark and deep as a forest pool, flew open and darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar log walls, the iron stove, the curious faces of the children. When her gaze landed on Ezra, it sharpened with a wild, cornered animal fear. She tried to sit up, a cry of pain escaping her as she put weight on her injured ankle. "Easy," Ezra said, holding up his hands, palms open. "You're safe here. We mean you no harm." She didn't understand his words, but she understood the tone. Her fear remained, but the panic subsided into a wary, intense observation. She refused the oatmeal he offered, her eyes tracking his every move. It was Esther who broke the impasse. Hesitantly, she approached the cot, holding a tin cup of water. She didn't speak, just held it out. The woman watched her for a long moment, her gaze softening almost imperceptibly. Finally, she reached out a trembling hand and took the cup, drinking thirstily. They called her the stranger, for they did not know her name. Communication was a clumsy dance of gestures and guesswork. Ezra would point to his chest and say, "Ezra." The woman would only stare back, her silence a wall he could not breach. His daughters, however, were less inhibited. Rose would bring her treasure ace, a smooth river stone, a bird's feather, and lay them by the cot. Cora, overcoming her fear, demonstrated how to work the butter churn. Days turned into a week. The woman, who Ezra learned was named Kia, when she finally whispered it to Rose, began to heal. Her ankle, expertly splintered by Ezra, was still weak, but she could limp around the small cabin. Her silence remained, but her actions began to speak for her. She was a watcher, her eyes missing nothing. She saw the fraying cuff on Ezra's shirt and the way he winced when he moved his shoulder, strained from lifting a feed sack. She saw Abigail's resentment, Hannah's quiet curiosity, and the way the younger girls craved a mother's touch. One afternoon, Ezra came in from the fields, bone-weary and smelling of sweat and earth. He found the cabin strangely quiet. Kia was sitting in Martha's old rocking chair, a place no one had occupied for 2 years. On her lap was a sleeping Rose, her head nestled against Kia's shoulder. Kia was humming, a low, melodic sound that was both sad and soothing. In her hands was his work shirt, and with a needle and thread scavenged from Martha's sewing basket, she was mending the torn cuff with stitches so small and perfect they were nearly invisible. Ezra stopped in the doorway, his heart catching in his throat. The scene was an echo of a life he thought was lost forever, the quiet domesticity, the gentle sound, the simple act of care. Abigail stood by the hearth, watching with a conflicted expression, her usual hostility softened by a grudging respect. Kia looked up and her eyes met Ezra's. The humming stopped. For a moment, the wall of silence between them seemed to dissolve, replaced by a fragile thread of shared understanding. She wasn't a stranger anymore. She was Kia, and her presence was starting to fill the hollow spaces in his house and in his heart in a way he hadn't thought possible. The slow thaw of mistrust continued in the small, unspoken moments of their shared existence. Ezra found that Kia had a knowledge of the land that rivaled his own, but in a different way. She would limp out into the prairie and return with roots and leaves he'd always considered weeds, adding them to their bland stews to give them a savory, earthy flavor. She taught Cora how to weave strong cord from yucca fibers and showed Hannah how to track the movements of rabbits by signs Ezra had never noticed. Her bond with the youngest girls was the firmest bridge between their two worlds. She had a patience that Ezra, worn thin by worry and work, often lacked. She would sit with Esther for hours, showing her how to make dolls from corn husks, her hands moving with a fluid grace. With Rose, she was endlessly gentle, wiping away tears with a soft touch and telling stories in her own tongue. The girls didn't understand the words, but they understood the cadence, the love woven into the sounds. Ezra watched it all, a strange mix of gratitude and a feeling he dared not name stirring within him. He started leaving a wildflower on the table for her in the mornings, a splash of Indian paintbrush or a bluebonnet. She never acknowledged it with words, but he would see her tuck it into the band of her dress or place it in a cup of water by her cot. The silence in the cabin was no longer empty. It was full of a quiet communication, a language of gestures and shared glances that spoke more than words ever could. One evening, a cool front moved in, bringing a sigh of relief from the summer's oppressive heat. They sat around the fire after a simple meal. Rose, sleepy and content, was curled at Kia's feet. Abigail, for the first time, sat near them without her customary scowl, watching Kia's hands as she deftly braided a strip of leather. "My mother," Abigail said suddenly, her voice quiet. "She used to braid my hair like that." Kia looked up, her gaze soft in the firelight. She didn't understand the words, but she heard the note of sorrow in them. She reached out and, with a tentative finger, touched a loose strand of Abigail's hair, her expression one of profound empathy. The gesture was small, but it was enough. The last wall of Abigail's resentment crumbled into dust. Later that night, long after the girls were asleep, Ezra sat on the porch, staring out at the star-dusted infinity of the sky. The door creaked open, and Kia emerged, wrapping a thin blanket around her shoulders. She stood beside him, her presence a comforting warmth in the cool night air. For a long time they stood in silence, listening to the chirping of crickets and the distant call of an owl. "Thank you," Ezra said, his voice low. He didn't know if she would understand, but he had to say it. "For what you do for the girls." She turned to him, her face illuminated by the pale moonlight. She pointed to her own chest. "Kia." Then she pointed to his. "Ezra." It was the first time she had said his name. Then she gestured to the house, where his daughters slept. She made a motion with her hands, like a bird sheltering its young beneath its wings. Finally, she looked at him and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was a simple acknowledgement, but it held a world of meaning. It said, "I see you, I see your burden, I understand." In that moment, standing under the vast, silent prairie sky, Ezra Weston realized he was no longer just sheltering a lost woman. He was sharing his life with her. The loneliness that had been his constant companion felt, for the first time, a little less absolute. But this fragile piece was a soap bubble, shimmering and beautiful, and utterly unprepared for the harsh realities of the world outside their small circle of light. The first hint of trouble came not from the open plains, but from the town of Redemption. Ezra had to ride in for supplies, flour, salt, coffee, a trip he'd put off for as long as he could. He left Abigail in charge, a heavy feeling of unease settling in his stomach. The town was a collection of dusty streets and false-fronted buildings, a place of hard-bitten men and women who viewed anything unfamiliar with deep suspicion. As he was loading his wagon outside the general store, a man named Donovan approached him. Donovan was a rancher with more land than sense and a mouth that was always twisted in a sneer of contempt. "Weston," he said, his voice oily, "heard you got yourself some company out at your place." Ezra's blood ran cold. He kept his expression neutral, hefting a sack of flour into the wagon bed. "The only company I've got is my 5 girls. You know that, Donovan." Donovan chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "That's not what I hear. My hand, Walter, was riding near your south pasture. Said he saw one of 'em, a Comanche squaw. Said she was right there by your house." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You gotta be careful, Weston. Folks round here get nervous about that sort of thing. It ain't decent, a man like you, with all them little girls, harboring a savage." Ezra's hand tightened on the wagon's side, his knuckles white. He turned to face Donovan, his eyes as hard as flint. "What I do on my own land is my business. You tell Walter to keep his eyes on your cattle and off my home." He climbed onto the wagon seat without another word and snapped the reins, leaving Donovan standing in the dust, a malicious smile playing on his lips. The ride home was fraught with a new kind of fear. It wasn't the abstract fear of loneliness or failure, but the sharp, specific terror of a known threat. Donovan's words were a poison that would spread through redemption, and Ezra knew it wouldn't be long before that poison led to action. He had to protect Kia. The thought was no longer a matter of duty, but a fierce, protective instinct that rose from the deepest part of him. When he reached the ranch, the sight of Kia in the yard, laughing as she played a game with Rose and Esther, both tightened the knot of fear in his chest and solidified his resolve. How could anyone look at this woman, at her gentleness and her quiet strength, and see a savage? That night, he tried to explain the danger. Using a piece of charcoal on a plank of wood, he drew a crude map of his ranch and the town. He drew stick figures with hats representing the townsmen and made their faces angry. He pointed from the town to the ranch, then at Kia, and shook his head, his expression grim. She understood immediately. Her face grew solemn, and a flicker of the old fear returned to her eyes. But it was quickly replaced by something else, resolve. She looked not toward the plains, toward escape, but at the 5 girls sleeping peacefully inside the cabin. Her place was here now, and she would not be run off easily. The threat from the town was a storm gathering on the horizon, but another storm was brewing from a different direction. A few days later, while riding the ridge overlooking his property, Ezra saw them. A small party of 5 riders, moving with a purpose and skill that spoke of long experience. They were not cowboys, they were Comanche. They moved with the land, not against it, their trail disciplined and direct. At their head rode a man with an air of immense authority, his face a mask of stern dignity, his hair streaked with gray. Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs. It was her people. They were looking for her. He was trapped between 2 fires, the simmering hatred of the town and the unknown intentions of the Comanche warriors. One group saw her as a threat to be eliminated. The other would see him as a captor to be punished. And in the middle of it all stood Kia and his 5 daughters, and the fragile, unspoken thing that had grown between them. He urged his horse down from the ridge, his mind racing. The quiet life he had cultivated in his isolation was about to be invaded, and he feared nothing would ever be the same. The 2 approaching threats converged on a blisteringly hot afternoon. The air was still and heavy, pregnant with a tension that mirrored the storm brewing in Ezra's soul. He had seen the Comanche party make camp in a shallow canyon 2 miles to the south. He knew they were observing, assessing. At the same time, a rider had galloped past his property an hour ago, heading back towards redemption. It could only mean one thing. Donovan had gathered his posse. Ezra stood on his porch, his Winchester rifle held loosely in his hands. He wasn't aiming it, but its weight was a grim comfort. Inside the cabin, Abigail was trying to keep the younger girls calm, her own face pale with fear. Kia stood just inside the doorway, her posture rigid, her eyes fixed on the track leading from town. She had put on the buckskin dress she'd been wearing when he found her, a silent declaration of who she was. She would not hide. They came as he knew they would. A dozen riders, led by Donovan, their faces a mixture of self-righteous fury and nervous excitement. They pulled up in a cloud of dust, a chaotic jumble of horses and armed men, their collective gaze filled with accusation. "Weston!" Donovan shouted, his voice ringing with false authority. "We know she's in there. Send out the Comanche squaw. We're here to deliver some proper frontier justice." "There's no justice in a mob," Ezra called back, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "This is my home. You have no business here. Ride on." "We ain't leaving without the savage," another man yelled, brandishing his pistol. "It ain't right, you keeping her here with your girls." Ezra's grip tightened on his rifle. "My girls are safer with her than they are with the likes of you. Now get off my land before you regret it." It was a standoff, a fragile moment stretched taut. The townsmen were hesitant to make the first move against a man they knew, but their numbers made them bold. Just as Donovan opened his mouth to give an order, a new sound cut through the tension, the rhythmic beat of unshod ponies. From the south, 5 riders appeared over the rise. They were the Comanche Ezra had seen, and they moved with a silent, lethal grace that made Donovan's posse look like clumsy boys playing at war. They fanned out, creating a formidable line between the ranch house and the townsmen, their faces impassive, their eyes missing nothing. The man at their head, the stern-faced chief, fixed his gaze on Ezra, then on the doorway where Kia stood. A soft gasp escaped Kia. "Father," she breathed, the word a mixture of relief and fear. The chief's eyes locked onto her, and for a moment the iron mask of his expression softened with a flicker of profound emotion. He was Kuruk, a name that commanded respect and fear across the plains. The situation had become impossibly volatile. Ezra was caught between a mob of his own people and a band of warriors whose intentions he could not know. Donovan, seeing the Comanche, seemed to find new courage in his prejudice. "See, Weston, they've come for her. They're savages, all of them." But Ezra wasn't looking at Donovan. He was looking at Kuruk. He lowered his Winchester slightly, a gesture of non-aggression, and took a step forward. He would not hide behind his rifle. He would stand as a man. "She was lost," Ezra said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. He directed his words to Kuruk, ignoring the posse. "Injured. I brought her here to heal. That is all." Before Kuruk could respond, Kia stepped out from the doorway, moving past Ezra. She walked with her head held high, her limp barely noticeable, a figure of incredible dignity. She ignored the leering faces of the townsmen and went straight to her father. She began to speak in the flowing, melodic language of the Comanche. Her voice was not pleading, but firm and clear. She gestured to the house, to the porch where the faces of Ezra's daughters were now visible, clustered together in the doorway. She pointed to her own mended ankle. Then she looked at Ezra, and her expression was one of undeniable respect and gratitude. She spoke for a long time, her words painting a picture for her father, the story of her rescue, of her healing, of the kindness she had found in this most unlikely of places. When she finished, a deep silence fell over the yard. Kuruk's gaze moved from his daughter to Ezra and then to the 5 girls huddled on the porch. He saw not a captor, but a tired man who had shown his child mercy. He saw not a prison, but a home where his daughter had been cared for. His eyes finally settled on the posse, and they were filled with a cold, undisguised contempt. He spoke a sharp command to his warriors. They shifted their positions, their lances held at the ready. Their message was unmistakable. The townsmen, who had been so bold moments before, began to fidget in their saddles. Their mob mentality evaporated in the face of true, disciplined strength. Kuruk spoke again, this time in broken but clear English, his voice like rocks grinding together. "This man," he said, nodding toward Ezra, "is a man of honor. My daughter was in his care. This is our business, not yours. Leave, now." Donovan sputtered, but the threat in Kuruk's voice was absolute. One by one, then, in a sudden, shameful rush, the men from Redemption turned their horses and rode away, their moment of righteous fury dissolving into a cloud of ignominious dust. The threat had been vanquished not by bullets, but by truth and an authority far older than the town of Redemption. The yard was quiet again, leaving only Ezra, Kia, and the Comanche warriors under the vast, watchful sky. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, Chief Kuruk dismounted. His warriors remained on their horses, silent sentinels, but his own posture relaxed slightly. He walked toward the porch, his gaze taking in every detail of the humble ranch house. He stopped before Ezra, his eyes, dark and knowing, searching the cowboy's face. "You saved my daughter," Kuruk said, the words a statement of fact, not a question. "I did what any decent man would have done," Ezra replied, his voice still hoarse with emotion. "Many decent men would have left her to die. Or worse," Kuruk countered, his gaze flicking toward the road where the posse had vanished. He looked at Kia, who stood beside Ezra now, a quiet bridge between the two men. "She has told me of this place, of your children, of your kindness." For the first time, Ezra saw Kuruk not as a fearsome chief, but as a father who had been sick with worry for his child. The relief and gratitude in his eyes were plain to see. Kuruk's gaze fell upon the 5 Western girls, who were now peeking from behind Abigail's skirts. A rare, faint smile touched his lips. "You have many daughters," he observed. "Yes, sir, 5 of them." Kuruk nodded slowly, a deep understanding dawning in his expression. He saw the whole picture, the motherless girls, the exhausted father trying to hold everything together, and his own daughter, who had found a purpose here, a place where her quiet strength was needed. He stayed for another hour, sharing a cup of water on the porch, while his men waited patiently. The conversation was sparse, translated by Kia, but a powerful understanding was forged in the silences. When it was time to leave, Kia hugged each of the girls, her farewells lingering longest with Rose and Esther. She and Ezra shared a long, searching look, a universe of unspoken emotions passing between them. Then she mounted the pony one of her father's men had brought for her and rode away, leaving behind a silence that was once again empty. The days that followed were heavy with her absence. The cabin felt too big, the chores more burdensome. The girls were listless, and even Abigail's face was clouded with a sadness she didn't try to hide. Ezra found himself staring at the rocking chair, expecting to see her there, humming her low, gentle song. The brief, fragile peace he had found was gone, and the loneliness returned with a vengeance, sharper now that he knew what its absence felt like. A week later, just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the plains, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. It was Kuruk and Kia. Ezra's heart leaped into his throat. He met them at the fence, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the gate. The girls came spilling out of the house, their faces alight with joy, shouting her name. Kia slid from her horse and was immediately engulfed in a sea of small, hugging arms. She laughed, a sound as clear and welcome as rain, and her eyes, shining with tears, found Ezra's over the heads of his daughters. Kuruk watched the scene, his face serene. He waited until the initial joyous reunion had subsided before he spoke. "Ezra Weston," he began, his tone formal, "I have come to speak with you." He gestured for Ezra to walk with him, away from the happy chatter of the girls and Kia. They stopped by the cottonwood tree that shaded Martha's grave. "My daughter was lost," Kuruk said, looking not at Ezra but at the horizon. "But in this place she found something, a home, a family that needed her." He turned to face Ezra directly. "And you, I see you are a good man, a strong man, but your heart is heavy with sorrow, and your hands are too full. A man cannot be both a father and a mother to 5 daughters. It is too much." Ezra could only nod, the truth of the words hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "My daughter," Kuruk continued, his voice resonating with quiet power, "has a heart that is strong and good. She knows how to make a home from nothing. She has brought laughter back to your children, and I see in her eyes that she has brought peace to your spirit." He paused, letting his next words settle with their full weight. "It is our way sometimes to build bridges between people, to make one family from two. You are a man of honor who needs a wife. You have 5 daughters who need a mother. I have a daughter who has found a place here, a woman who looks at you with respect in her heart." He held Ezra's gaze, his proposal laid bare between them, simple and profound. "I ask you to take my daughter, Kia, as your wife, to make her the mother of your children and the keeper of your home, to build a new family, together." Ezra was stunned into silence. The proposition was so audacious, so far beyond the realm of anything he could have imagined, yet it made a strange and perfect sense. It was not a transaction of property, but a joining of needs, a weaving together of 2 broken families into a single, stronger whole. He looked over at the house. In the warm lamplight spilling from the doorway, he could see the silhouette of Kia surrounded by his daughters. Abigail was showing her a new dress she had sewn. Hannah was holding her hand, and Rose was nestled in her lap. Laughter drifted across the yard, a sound that had been so rare for so long. Kia looked up, as if she could feel his gaze, and her eyes met his across the twilight. In her expression, he saw no fear, no hesitation, only a quiet, steady hope. He looked at the grave beneath the cottonwood, a silent acknowledgement of the love and the life that had been. Martha was gone, and the grief would always be a part of him. But perhaps, he thought, a heart was big enough to hold both a memory and a new beginning. He looked back at Kuruk, then at Kia and his girls, a constellation of hope in the gathering dark. The loneliness that had defined him for so long was finally, truly beginning to recede, replaced by the terrifying, beautiful possibility of a shared future. A quiet peace settled over him, earned through hardship and discovered in the most unexpected of kindnesses. He did not have his answer yet, but for the first time in 2 years, he knew he would find it not in solitude, but in connection. He was not alone anymore. The year was 1878, and the silence of the prairie was a living thing. It had weight and texture, pressing in on the small sod house Clara Weston called home. It was a silence that had long ago swallowed the echoes of her husband's laughter, the hearty ring of his axe against wood, the simple shared murmur of 2 lives lived as one. Now, all that remained was the ceaseless monologue of the wind, a lonely voice that spoke of nothing but immensity and indifference. Clara's world had shrunk to the size of her 160-acre claim, a square of stubborn earth carved from the vast, rolling sea of grass. Her days were a litany of chores, a rhythm of survival that left little room for the debilitating grief that still ambushed her in the quiet hours. She mended fences, tended her small garden, milked her solitary cow, and stared out at a horizon that offered no comfort, only more of itself. The land was a beautiful tyrant, demanding constant vigilance. Its beauty was sharp-edged, found in the bruised purples of a twilight sky, or the fierce gold of a sunrise that set the frost to glittering, but it was a beauty that did not care if she lived or died. It had been 2 years since Arthur was taken, not by sickness or violence, but by the land itself. A flash flood in the creek bed, a torrent of brown water that appeared from nowhere and vanished just as fast, leaving behind a world irrevocably altered. She had found him downstream, tangled in the roots of a cottonwood, the same tree where they had once carved their initials inside a lopsided heart. The memory was a shard of glass in her mind. If she turned her thoughts the wrong way, it would slice deep. So, she learned not to turn. She learned to live on the surface of her life, a stoic, capable woman who spoke more to her cow, Beatrice, than she had to any human being in months. The nearby town of Providence was a half-day's ride, a journey she made only when necessity screamed louder than her desire for solitude. The townspeople saw a grieving widow, a figure of pity and some suspicion. A woman alone was an anomaly, an unsettling disruption to the natural order of things. Their whispers followed her from the general store to the blacksmith, whispers of concern laced with judgment. They wondered why she stayed, why she did not sell the claim and return east to whatever family she had left. They could not understand that the homestead, this place of profound loss, was also the last place she had been truly happy. Leaving it would be like losing Arthur all over again. So she stayed, cocooned in her silence, her grief a familiar cloak. Her resilience was a thing born not of courage, but of sheer grinding necessity. Each sunrise was a command to rise, each sunset a permission to rest. Her existence was a flat, unbroken line, and she had resigned herself to walking it until her time was done. She expected nothing to change. The prairie, she believed, had already taken everything it could from her. She was wrong. It happened on an afternoon when the sun was a hot, white coin in a bleached blue sky. The wind, for once, was still, and the air hung heavy and thick with the scent of dust and drying grass. Clara was returning from the creek, buckets of water weighing down her arms, her gaze fixed on the worn path to her door. That was when she saw him. He was on horseback, a lone rider moving parallel to her property line, his silhouette stark against the endless green-gold canvas of the plains. He was Cheyenne. The stark plains of his face, his dark braids, the way he sat his pony with an easy, rooted grace, it all spoke of a world utterly separate from her own. Fear, cold and immediate, prickled its way up her spine. It was a conditioned response, drilled into her by the stories and warnings of town, tales of raids and savagery that painted every native man as a looming threat. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The buckets grew impossibly heavy. He had not seen her yet. He was looking ahead, his expression unreadable, a study in stoic resolve. He was close, too close, 100 yards, perhaps less. She watched him, mesmerized by a terror that was also laced with a strange, unwelcome curiosity. He was not a monster from a story. He was a man moving through his own world, a world that had been here long before her sod house had ever scarred its surface. As he drew level with her position, a slight gust of wind, a sudden exhalation from the resting day, stirred the air. It lifted a single magnificent feather from his hair. It was a golden eagle feather, long and perfectly marked, tipped with a plume of white and bound at its base with intricate red thread. It pirouetted in the air, a slow, lazy spiral, before drifting down and landing softly in the grass, not 20 feet from where she stood. The brave, Vokin, did not seem to notice its absence. He continued on, his pace steady, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Clara's mind screamed at her to run, to get inside, bar the door, and pray he passed without incident. That was the sensible thing to do. That was what Arthur would have told her to do. But her feet remained rooted to the spot. Her eyes were fixed on the feather. It lay in the grass like a fallen star, a piece of sacred sky brought down to earth. She knew with a certainty that defied all logic and fear what it meant. She had heard whispers in town, fragments of conversations about the plains tribes. An eagle feather was not a mere decoration. It was honor, it was courage, it was a life story. To let it lie there, to be trampled by buffalo or bleached by the sun, felt like a desecration. It was a violation of an order she did not belong to, but could somehow, inexplicably, recognize. The fear in her chest battled with a different, more powerful impulsive instinct for reverence, for restoring a thing to its rightful place. Her heart was a wild drum. He was moving farther away with every passing second. If she was going to act, it had to be now. Before the cold voice of reason could reassert itself, Clara set the water buckets down with a thud. Her hands were trembling as she walked, not toward her house, but out into the open grass. She moved cautiously, her eyes darting between the rider's receding back and the precious object on the ground. She reached the feather and knelt, her fingers hesitating for a moment before closing around the quill. It was warm, as if it still held the heat of the man who had worn it. It was lighter than it looked, yet it felt heavy in her hand, heavy with significance. Holding it aloft, she took a deep breath and called out, her voice rusty from disuse. "Wait!" The word was thin, snatched by the vastness, but he heard it. He reined in his pony, the animal stopping with fluid ease. For a long moment, he did not turn. Clara's blood ran cold. She had made a terrible mistake. She had drawn his attention. She was alone, exposed, a fool. Then, slowly, he turned his head, and his eyes found her. They were dark, penetrating, and utterly devoid of the menace she had expected. There was only a profound, unnerving stillness in his gaze. He looked at her, standing there in her faded calico dress, a lone white woman holding his eagle feather. He looked at the feather, then back at her. Clara's fear did not vanish, but it shifted, making room for a different kind of tension. She was no longer just an object of potential violence. She was part of an interaction, a silent, uncertain negotiation. Holding the feather out, she took a few hesitant steps toward him. She stopped at a respectable distance, her arm outstretched, the feather offered on her open palm. He urged his pony forward, closing the distance between them, not with a threatening charge, but with a slow, deliberate pace. He stopped just a few feet away. The sheer presence of him was overwhelming. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps her own age. A long, faded scar cut a pale line across one high cheekbone. His eyes, now that he was closer, were not cold. They were watchful, intelligent, and held a deep, old sorrow that she recognized, for she saw it in her own reflection every morning. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, his gaze intense, searching her face for what? Deceit? Malice? He saw none. He reached out, his movements economical and precise, and took the feather from her palm. His fingers brushed against hers, a touch as brief and light as a moth's wing, yet it sent a jolt through her entire body. It was the first human touch she had felt in 2 years. He secured the feather back in his hair, his actions deliberate, almost ritualistic. Then he looked at her again. He gave a single, sharp nod. It was not a thank you in the way she understood it. It was something more. It was an acknowledgement, a recognition, a mark of respect that crossed the chasm of language, culture, and fear that separated them. And then, without another gesture, he turned his pony and rode on, continuing his journey as if nothing had happened. Clara stood motionless, her hands still tingling, and watched until he was a tiny speck that finally merged with the horizon. Only when he was gone did she realize she was breathing again, her lungs aching. She walked back to her water buckets, her legs unsteady, and finished the short walk to her sod house. That night, for the first time in a long time, the silence did not feel empty. It felt watchful. The days that followed were different. The flat, unbroken line of her existence now had a sharp, singular point of deviation. The memory of the encounter played over and over in her mind, a relentless loop of image and feeling, the dark, assessing eyes, the brief, shocking touch of his fingers, the solemn nod. It had shattered the stupor of her grief. The acute pain of Arthur's absence was still there, a constant ache in her bones, but it was now accompanied by a new sensation, a profound and unsettling curiosity. She found herself scanning the horizon, a habit she had abandoned long ago. Before, she had looked for Arthur, a foolish, desperate hope that he might just ride up over the next rise. Now she was not sure what or who she was looking for. She felt a strange connection to the land she had previously only seen as an adversary. The man, Vokin, was a part of this land, and by interacting with him, she had inadvertently touched its raw, mysterious heart. Her fear subsided, replaced by a kind of nervous energy. The world felt larger, more complicated than she had allowed it to be. The prejudices of Providence seemed small and brittle things when held up against the weight of that silent, respectful moment. She had been taught to fear, but the man had not shown her menace. He had shown her dignity. A week passed, the rhythm of her chores returned, but her internal landscape was forever changed. She was weeding her garden, the sun warm on her back when she saw it. On the top of the fence post, nearest the spot where she had returned the feather, there was something new. It was a small object, placed with obvious care. Her heart gave a little skip. She wiped her earthy hands on her apron and walked slowly toward the post. It was a bird. A small, exquisitely carved bird, no bigger than her thumb, whittled from a piece of pale cottonwood. Its lines were simple but perfect, capturing the essence of a meadowlark in mid-song, its head thrown back in silent music. The wood was smooth, polished by patient hands. She picked it up. It was a gift, a response, a continuation of the silent conversation they had started. It was his way of completing the exchange, of balancing the scales. She had returned what was his, and now he had given her something in return. A thing of beauty, created from the very same kind of tree that held the memory of her deepest sorrow. Clara closed her fingers around the tiny carving, the smooth wood a comfort in her palm. A tear, hot and unexpected, slid down her cheek. It was not a tear of grief, not entirely. It was something else, something more complex. It was a tear for the bridge that had been built across an impossible divide, a tear for an act of grace in a world that had shown her so little of it. She took the little bird inside and placed it on the mantelpiece, right next to the faded photograph of her and Arthur, their faces young and full of foolish, beautiful hope. The two objects, one representing her past and the other a bewildering present, sat together in the quiet light of her home. It was 2 days after she found the carving that her world broke open for the second time. She was churning butter, the rhythmic thump and slosh a familiar comfort, when a low, deep sound reached her. It was not the wind. It was a sound that vibrated up from the earth itself, a resonant thrumming that made the tins on her shelf hum softly. She stilled her hands, her head cocked, listening. The sound grew, resolving itself into the steady, powerful beat of dozens of horses' hooves. Not the frantic gallop of a stampede, but the measured, deliberate cadence of a procession. Her first thought was the town posse, though what they would be doing this far out she could not imagine. She wiped her hands and went to the door, her stomach tightening with a familiar knot of dread. She opened the door a crack and peered out, and her blood ran ice-cold. They were cresting the low rise to the west, the same direction from which the lone brave had come. But this was not one man, this was an army. An entire delegation of Cheyenne warriors and elders, riding in a wide, formidable formation. They moved without haste, their ponies stepping proudly, their pace infused with a solemn purpose. Sunlight glinted off lances, off the silver and beadwork that adorned their buckskin shirts. Feathers of every color and meaning stirred in the breeze. Clara's mind struggled to process the scale of what she was seeing. There were dozens of them. She tried to count, her eyes darting frantically across the line, but lost her place. There were at least 40, maybe more. They were not passing by. They were coming directly toward her house. Panic, pure and absolute, seized her. This was it, the consequence of her foolish act. She had interacted with one of them, and now his entire tribe had come for retribution. The stories from town, the ones she had dismissed, came roaring back with terrifying clarity. They would burn her out, take her cow, take her life. Her hand flew to her throat. She slammed the door shut and threw the heavy wooden bar across it, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. She backed away from the door, her eyes wide with terror, scanning her small home for a weapon, for an escape. There was Arthur's old rifle above the mantel, but she was a poor shot, and what good would one rifle be against so many? There was nowhere to run. The prairie offered no hiding places. She was a tiny island in a sea of grass, and the tide was coming in. The sound of the hooves grew louder, a thunderous heartbeat that seemed to shake the very foundations of her sod house. They were in her yard now. The sound stopped, and then there was silence. A silence more terrifying than the thunder had been. It was a heavy, expectant silence. They were waiting. Clara stood in the center of her small room, trembling like a leaf. Every nerve screamed. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Why did they not attack? Why did they not break down the door? The waiting was a form of torture. She pressed her hands against her ears, but she could not block out the sound of her own frantic heart. She could picture them out there, surrounding her home, their dark eyes watching, their faces grim. She was going to die here, alone, because of a moment of inexplicable compassion. Then a voice called out. It was a deep, resonant voice, speaking in Cheyenne. The words were incomprehensible to her, but the tone was not threatening. It was commanding, yet calm. There was a pause, and then another man spoke, this time in halting, heavily accented English. "Woman who returns, the sky. We know you are in there. We do not come for war. Woman who returns, the sky." The name was so poetic, so strange, it momentarily pierced through her terror. It took her a second to realize they were talking about her, about the feather. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion, not for war. It was a trick. It had to be. Yet, the voice held no malice. She crept back to the door, pressing her ear against the rough wood. She could hear the soft snorts of the ponies, the creak of leather, the faint rustle of the wind. No war cries, no angry shouts. Another voice spoke, this one older, full of gravel and authority. He spoke in Cheyenne, a long, flowing speech. The sound was mesmerizing, like stones tumbling in a river. When he finished, the translator spoke again. "Our elder, Honya Haka, asks you to show yourself. He says your heart spoke a truth that day, and our council has come to hear it with our own ears. He gives his word you will not be harmed." Honya Haka, the council. Clara's fear was still a physical sickness inside her, but a tiny seed of disbelief was planted within it. Could this be true? Could this awe-inspiring, terrifying assembly truly be here for a peaceful purpose? To stand against 44 armed Cheyenne chiefs was suicide. But to hide behind a barred door felt like an act of cowardice and disrespect that might be just as deadly. She thought of the small carved bird on her mantle. It was not the act of a man who intended her harm. Her hand, shaking uncontrollably, reached for the wooden bar. Her fingers fumbled with the heavy latch. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she lifted the bar from its cradle. The sound was deafeningly loud in the silence. She pulled the door inward, squinting against the bright afternoon light. And she saw them. They were arranged in a great, silent crescent before her home. 44 men, the Council of 44, the sacred governing body of the entire Cheyenne nation. They were elders, their faces maps of wisdom and hardship, and younger, powerful warriors in the prime of their lives. In the center, slightly ahead of the others, sat an old man on a fine gray pony. His face was a web of deep lines, his white hair braided with otter fur. His eyes, though ancient, were as clear and sharp as a hawk's. This was Honya Haka. And beside him, his expression as impassive as stone, sat Vokin, the young brave she had met. Clara stood framed in her doorway, a lone woman in a faded dress, her hands clenched in her apron. The sheer gravity of the moment stole the air from her lungs. This was not a raid. This was a state visit. This was history, unfolding on her dusty doorstep. Honya Haka watched her, his gaze missing nothing. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the resolve that had made her open the door. He saw the small, clean house behind her, the neatly tended garden. He saw the ghost of sorrow that clung to her like a shawl. He spoke again, his voice carrying easily in the still air, and the translator relayed his words. "The feather you returned to my grandson, Vokin," he began, his eyes indicating the young brave, "was not his to lose. It was carried for his brother, who fell in battle against the Bluecoats 2 moons ago. It is the feather of a chief, and it holds his spirit. To lose it is to lose his memory on the wind. For it to be lost in the dirt was a great shame to our family and a sorrow to our people." Clara's eyes flickered to Vokin. For the first time, she saw the profound grief etched into his stoic features, a mirror of her own. He was carrying a memorial, just as she was. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. "You, a white woman whose people have brought us much pain," Honyahaka continued, his voice even, without accusation, "saw this sacred thing. You were taught to fear us. You could have let it lie. You could have run. But you did not. You picked it up. You showed it honor. You returned it to its guardian. An enemy does not do this. An enemy does not see." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the prairie. Clara felt the eyes of all 44 chiefs upon her, gazes of intense, silent scrutiny. They were not judging her. They were measuring her spirit. "Vokin told the council what you did. He told us he looked in your eyes and saw no hate. He saw respect. This was a difficult thing for the council to believe. Our world has been filled with broken words and empty gestures from your people, but the carving he left for you was not disturbed. It was taken in." He gestured toward her house. "This also speaks a truth." Clara's heart was still pounding, but the terror was receding, replaced by a wave of stunned, humbling understanding. This was not about her. It was about a gesture that had rippled outward in ways she could never have conceived. An act of simple decency that had been interpreted as a profound statement of peace. "The Council of 44 has ridden for 3 days to look upon the woman with a respectful heart," Honyahaka declared, his voice ringing with authority. "We have come to understand why a spirit of peace would choose to rest in such a lonely place. We have come to see if what our eyes tell us is true." He was testing her. This was the final, crucial moment. Her response would define everything. The town of Providence would tell her to slam the door, to fetch her rifle, to scream for help that would never come. Her fear told her to shrink back into the shadows of her home. But her heart, the same impulsive heart that had made her pick up the feather, told her to do something else entirely. She looked at the old chief, at the deep lines of his face, at the sorrow and wisdom in his eyes. She saw a man who understood loss. She saw a leader who had traveled far, not for conquest, but for understanding. And in that moment, she was no longer a frightened widow. She was the mistress of this home, however humble. Straightening her shoulders, Clara unclenched her hands from her apron. She met Honyahaka's gaze directly, her own eyes clear, and she did the only thing that felt right. She stepped aside, opening the door wider, and gestured toward the simple, clean interior of her home. "You have traveled a long way, sir," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Will you come in and rest? I have fresh water." A deep, collective stillness fell over the assembled council. Even the horses seemed to hold their breath. The translator's jaw went slack for a moment before he stammered out her words in Cheyenne. Honyahaka's ancient face broke into a slow, profound smile. It was like watching the sun rise over a weathered mountain. He had seen what he came to see. He gave a sharp command. With a fluid grace that belied his age, he dismounted from his pony. He handed the reins to another warrior, and with slow, deliberate steps, he walked across the dusty yard and stopped before her threshold. He was a great chief, a man who held the destiny of a nation in his hands, yet he paused at her door, waiting for the invitation to be affirmed. Clara nodded, her heart full of a feeling she could not name. It was awe, it was terror, it was a strange and powerful sense of rightness. Honyahaka bowed his head slightly and stepped across her threshold, entering her home. He was the only one to enter. The other 43 chiefs remained mounted, a silent, watchful honor guard. Vokin's eyes met Clara's for a fleeting second across the space, and in them she saw the stone of his grief give way to a flicker of something else, gratitude. Inside, the small room seemed to shrink around the chief's presence. Clara moved to the bucket and dipped a clean tin cup into the cool water, her hands still trembling slightly. She offered it to him. He took it with both hands, a sign of respect, and drank deeply. He looked around the room, his eyes taking in the sparse, clean furnishings, the neatly stacked firewood, and finally resting on the mantelpiece. He saw the photograph of the smiling young couple, and beside it, the small, pale bird. He pointed a weathered finger at the carving. "My grandson has a good hand," he said, his English direct and clear, surprising her, "but a heavy heart." "I am sorry for his loss," Clara said softly, and she meant it more than she had ever meant anything. "He is not the only one in this room who carries such a burden," Honyahaka replied, his gaze gentle as it met hers. He looked back at the photograph. "A good man?" "The best," Clara whispered, the word thick with unshed tears. "It is a hard land for a woman alone," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "It is," she agreed. He finished the water and handed the cup back to her. He then reached into a pouch at his side and drew out a long, flat object wrapped in soft buckskin. He unwrapped it with ceremonial slowness. It was a pipe. The bowl was carved from a deep red stone, the stem long and decorated with intricate beadwork and small, downy feathers. "This is the pipe of my father," Honyahaka said, his voice low and reverent. "We do not share it with enemies. We do not share it with liars. We share it with friends, with family." He did not light it. The gesture was purely symbolic, but he held it out to her. He was offering her a place in that circle of trust. Clara understood. She reached out and, following an instinct she did not know she possessed, placed both of her hands on the pipe's stem, her touch light and respectful. "We will not forget this house," Honyahaka said, his voice a solemn vow. "The Cheyenne have long memories. We remember our enemies, but we remember our friends longer. The land will still be hard. The winter will still be cold. Your people in the town of white men may not understand, but you will not be alone. The woman who returns, the sky will be known to us. This ground is protected ground." He wrapped the pipe back in its buckskin covering and tucked it away. His visit was over. He had done what he came to do. With another slow nod, he turned and walked out of her home, back into the bright sunlight. He mounted his pony, his movements fluid and certain. He raised a hand, a sign to the council. And then, as one, the 44 chiefs turned their horses and began the long ride back the way they had come. They did not look back. There was no need. A promise had been made. Clara stood in her doorway, her hand pressed to her chest, and watched them go, the sound of their departure a receding tide, until once again there was only the vast, overwhelming silence of the prairie. But it was a different silence now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the resonance of a promise. She looked out at the rolling hills and saw not a threat, but a sanctuary. On her doorstep, left where the chief had stood, was a single perfect golden eagle feather. The news, as Honyahaka had predicted, was not received well in Providence. It traveled on the wind, carried by a lone prospector who had witnessed the incredible spectacle from a distant ridge. The story grew more fantastical with each telling. Clara Weston, the quiet widow, had consorted with a savage war party. She was a traitor to her kind, an Indian lover who had put the entire settlement at risk. The stares she received on her next trip to town were no longer laced with pity. They were hard with suspicion and cold with contempt. Mr. Shaw at the general store served her in stony silence, his face a mask of disapproval. Old Martha McBride, who had once offered her condolences with a jar of preserves, now gathered her skirts and crossed the street to avoid walking past her. Clara was more isolated from her own people than ever before. She was an outcast. Yet, something fundamental had shifted within her. Their judgment, which once would have devastated her, now felt small and distant. Their fear was a product of an ignorance she no longer shared. She had looked into the heart of what they feared and had found not savagery, but honor, grief, and a profound capacity for grace. Their ostracism could not touch the new foundation that had been laid in her soul. She returned to her homestead, to the silence that was now her friend. The land did not change. The winters were still brutal, the summers still scorched the earth. The work was just as hard, the loneliness just as present. But she was not the same. She no longer felt like a victim of the prairie. She felt like a part of it. She had an alliance, not with a government or a town, but with the people whose spirits were woven into the very fabric of the plains. She never saw Vokin again. She never saw the great chief Honyahaka, but their presence remained. Sometimes she would find a brace of rabbits left on her fence post. Once, after a particularly brutal blizzard had trapped her for a week, she emerged to find a path cleared to her woodpile and fresh deer tracks leading away into the snow. They were silent, unseen guardians, honoring their chief's promise in their own quiet way. Clara lived on that land for another 50 years. She never remarried, she never left. The town of Providence grew, and eventually the harshest judgments softened into a kind of grudging, legendary respect for the strange, solitary woman who held her ground. She became a story herself, a piece of local folklore, but for Clara, life was not a story. It was the steady, quiet rhythm of a life redeemed not from grief, but within it. In the evenings, she would sit on her porch, the small carved meadowlark and the eagle feather from Honyahaka resting on the table beside her. She would look out at the horizon, at the sky bruising into nightfall, and she would feel Arthur's memory beside her, a gentle presence, no longer a source of sharp pain, but a deep, quiet love. The silence was not empty. It was full of memory, full of peace, and full of the knowledge that in the heart of an unforgiving land, she had found the most unexpected thing of all. She had found a home.